At the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Assistant Treasury Secretary Daniel Glaser talked about what the U.S. government's doing to stop ISIS from raising money and accessing the global finance system. This is an hour and 15 minutes.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're about to begin, so if you can finish filling your plate and take a seat, that would be great. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm Matt Levitt, Director of the Stein Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence, and this is the latest in our Counterterrorism Lecture Series. It gives me great pleasure to welcome my good friend and colleague, Danny Glaser. Danny is the Assistant Secretary for Terror Financing in the Treasury Department's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. Once upon a time, Danny and I served as Deputy Assistant Secretaries together. Danny can tolerate the bureaucracy much better than I can. He stuck it out and is now an Assistant Secretary. I think the longest serving person in the Treasury Department on this set of issues, going back long before there was a TFI at Treasury. And it's a great pleasure to have Danny back here today. It's not his first time in this hot seat. Today we're going to be talking about the evolution of terrorism financing, and in particular the specific issues that go into disrupting the Islamic State, which has a very different set of means of raising and moving, laundering, and spending money. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon, those of you who are here in the room with us in person, and those of you who are participating across a television screen with C-SPAN. So with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Assistant Secretary Danny Glaser.
Thank you, Matt, for that very nice introduction. And Matt and I were colleagues at Treasury for a number of years, and it was great working with him in that capacity, and it's certainly been great working with him ever since. And it's an honor for me to be here today to see a lot of familiar faces out in the crowd. I'm very flattered that people are interested to come and hear what we have to say about how we're approaching the issue of ISIL financing at the Treasury Department and in the U.S. government more broadly. I think it's a positive story. I think this is an area where we have great challenges, but we've also made tremendous progress. And I want to talk about the challenges that we face, and I'll talk a little bit about how ISIL raises its revenue, talk about our strategy to address those issues, and talk about where I think things are going from there. And that's going to be my remarks, my prepared remarks. When we get to the Q&A, if people have questions about terrorist financing more broadly, I'm certainly happy to address any of those questions as well. So let me just jump right into it and talk about the unique challenge that ISIL does present us. When you think about terrorist financing, it's conceptually pretty simple. Now, there's infinite varieties, but it's actually conceptually pretty simple when you think about how we try to address terrorist financing. There's two parts. We try to prevent terrorists from raising money, and we try to prevent them from gaining access to the financial system so they can't spend their money. That's it. That's counter-terrorist financing in a nutshell. You interfere with a group's ability to generate revenue so they don't have money to spend, and then interfere with their ability to gain access to the financial system so they can't spend the money that they have. That's what terrorist financing is in a nutshell. Again, with infinite varieties among terrorist organizations in different situations, but that's conceptually how we approach any terrorist organization when we think about disrupting its financing. Traditionally, when we think about terrorist organizations, we use very similar tools to approach both. When you think about Al-Qaeda, when you think about any number of terrorist organizations that primarily receive their funds externally, by attacking their access to the financial system, we can both prevent them from raising revenue, and we can prevent them from using revenue. What's really unique about ISIL is the fact that it generates such a substantial portion of its revenue internally. Now, we've had there are terrorist organizations in the past and currently that control territory. Hamas controls territory. Al-Shabaab, to a certain extent, controls territory. But the sheer size, the vast wealth that ISIL has been able to generate internally really makes it a qualitatively different challenge from any organization that we've seen before. And it's really required us to take a qualitatively different approach from what we've done before. So let me talk a little bit about the first part with ISIL, the generating revenue, and then I'll talk a little bit about the second part, interfering with their access to the international financial system. So sources of revenue for ISIL. The numbers. So whenever I speak publicly about ISIL, I give some numbers, and these are 2015 numbers. These are estimates that we have from 2015, and what we've generally said is that they generated about $1 billion in revenue, maybe even a little bit more than that in 2015, and those are primarily from 3 different sources. The first source is oil and gas, sales of oil and gas. And the number that we have used for 2015 is $500 million. Now, I think the number is substantially less than that now, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But in 2015, we estimate that they made probably about $500 million off of the sale of oil and gas. The second important source of revenue is taxation and extortion. People like to say extortion because we don't want to, the use of the word taxation seems to legitimize ISIL as a government, so we like to use the word extortion. But to be honest with you, taxation is probably closer, more descriptive of what's going on, as they really do levy fees and taxes among the populations that they control. Again, our estimate for this for 2015 was $30 million per month, or $360 million per year from taxation. And again, that's an internal source. So I've just rattled off $860 million of internally generated revenue for ISIL. And then finally, in 2014, 2015, when ISIL came and took Mosul, there was in excess of $500 million worth of cash in bank vaults in Mosul, primarily in the state-owned banks and in the central bank branch in Mosul. So that's another approximately $500 million that was available in Mosul when ISIL came rolling in, and that really does, those 3 things together really make up the lion's share, by far the lion's share of ISIL's financing. Now, there is some external financing that comes. There's taxation, kidnapping for ransom. There's a variety of other sources, but those are all frankly quite small in comparison to again, can't emphasize enough the vast wealth that they're able to raise internally within their territory. So that certainly creates a challenge for an organization like the Treasury Department, as I said, we've sort of traditionally specialized in preventing these groups from getting access to the financial system. But how do you really prevent them from getting access to wealth that's internal to their territory? And the answer is, there's more of a military solution to this than most terrorist financing issues, and it's pretty unusual to have a Assistant Secretary of the Treasury stand up before a crowd and talk about military operations, but that's precisely what I'm going to talk about now for a few minutes, because that's a really important part of our counter-terrorist financing efforts within ISIL. The coalition has launched an air campaign called Tidal Wave 2. Tidal Wave 2 began in November and is ongoing, and the purpose of Tidal Wave 2 is to attack the entire supply chain, in the oil and gas sector. It is attacking the ability of ISIL to extract oil and gas, its ability to refine, and its ability to transport. And this is something that we work very, very closely with the Defense Department on, with the military on, and with the coalition. And this is a very deliberate campaign. It's a very intelligent campaign, and it's one that I think is substantially impacting ISIL's ability to extract wealth and to extract oil and gas and to make that available. So that's the first part, and that's the military portion. There are other ways to prevent ISIL from getting from gaining wealth from its territory, and the most important of those is preventing liquidity from flowing into the area in the first place. If there's less liquidity in the area, there's less funds that could be taxed. Frankly, it's our view, it's our very strong view that the very large portion of ISIL's ability to even get profit from its oil and gas, it's sold internally. We do not think there's a lot of smuggling going on with oil and gas outside of ISIL territory. The money that they make off of that is sales internally. Again, going to liquidity. So to the extent that we can impact liquidity within ISIL territory, we can impact their ability to profit off of oil. We could impact their ability to profit off of taxation and extortion. The most important step in this direction was about a year ago when the Iraqi government took the decision to terminate the payment of government salaries into ISIL-controlled territory and to instead hold those salary payments in escrow. Prior to that decision, there was about $170 million per month that was going into ISIL-controlled territory in the form of government salary payments. That's $2 billion a year. I don't know. I mean, we don't know for sure exactly what the tax rate is in ISIL-controlled territory. We'd take a conservative estimate and say 10%. I mean, 10% of $2 billion is a lot of money to ISIL. And the decision of the Iraqi government to terminate that was a very, very important decision, and it's one that we continue to talk to them about and work with them on. There continues to be challenges with respect to that decision, but I do think from a terrorist financing perspective it was one of the most important steps that anybody has taken in the area of counter-terrorist financing with respect to ISIL. And then finally, bulk cash. So the good news about that in excess of half a billion dollars that was in the vaults for ISIL is that was a one-time take for them. That's not a renewable source the way oil is a renewable source, the way taxation might be a renewable source. So they're not going to get another $500 million or more from vaults. Once they spend that money down, that money is not going to be available to them. We've been helping, again, on the military side of things by and there's been at least millions of dollars, is the phrase that we use, at least millions of dollars of bulk cash that has been literally incinerated as a result of these, as a result of the air campaign. So that is how we're approaching ISIL's ability to generate revenue. This is going to be an ongoing effort, but I do think that we can demonstrate that we've had an impact. We've seen that in certain areas, in Raqqa, in the Raqqa area, for example, we've seen the salaries of ISIL fighters drop by 50%. And the fighters in the Raqqa area are not the first people who have their salaries drop. I could assure you that. That is a sign of financial distress on ISIL. We've also seen a rise in internal corruption within ISIL. We've seen ISIL is very concerned about this themselves, and they've launched their own anti-corruption investigations because they understand that with the decrease in resources available to them, there's going to be an increase of people with their hands in the cookie jar. And this is a real problem for ISIL, and it's one that we see growing. We've also seen an increase in arbitrary fees and fines that ISIL is charging the citizens in the territories that they control, and we've seen an increase in taxation in the territories that they control in an attempt to make up some of the difference. So we've seen signs of financial distress on ISIL, and we're going to continue the campaign, and we're going to continue to do everything we can to deprive them of access to as much resources as possible. That said, we're not going to be 100% successful. We're not going to bring them down to zero. We know that. So it is also important that we focus on the other half, what I call the more traditional portion of the terrorist financing effort, and that's depriving them of access to the international financial system so that they cannot make use of the money that they have. This effort really starts with the Iraqis themselves, and we work very closely with the Iraqis, and the Iraqis actually take this issue quite seriously. I have a very good, close relationship with Central Bank Governor Alak, and the Iraqis are quite focused on making sure that they're doing everything they can to protect their financial system from access by ISIL. So where that started was banks. There were approximately 90 Iraqi bank branches in territory that ISIL controlled when ISIL basically took Mosul and took that portion of Iraq. There were approximately 90 Iraqi bank branches. And almost immediately, we were working with the Iraqis to ensure that those bank branches were cut off from their headquarters almost entirely in Baghdad. Maybe there were a couple that had headquarters in Erbil as well. But the goal was to make sure that those bank branches were entirely cut off from their headquarters in Baghdad. In so doing, it cuts them off from the financial system as a whole, because none of those banks have the ability to actually conduct international transactions outside of going through their headquarters. There was actually one that did have that ability, and the Iraqis immediately forced that bank to move its headquarters to Baghdad precisely so that what then became a branch did not have the ability to conduct international transactions. So, you never say never. You never say something's not a risk or a threat anymore. But that's really not where I think the focus of our attention should be, those bank branches. I think those bank branches are, to the extent that you could trust in anything, those bank branches are in a pretty good place right now. Where I think the bigger concern is exchange houses. There's approximately 1,900 exchange houses in Iraq as a whole. And to the extent that ISIL is gaining access to the financial system, I think that's really where we need to be looking. And that's where the Iraqis are looking as well. There's a short-term portion to this problem, and then there's a longer-term solution to this problem. In the longer term, they need to shrink that sector down. 1,900 exchange houses is not an appropriate number of exchange houses for Iraq. The Iraqis understand that, and they have a plan to get that number down substantially. And we're working very closely with them at the Treasury Department, working with the Iraqis to put them in a position where they could have a reasonable number of exchange houses that could be reasonably overseen, supervised, and regulated. In the short term, what we need to focus on is making sure that the exchange houses that are either in ISIL-controlled territory or that are willing to work with ISIL are dealt with appropriately. The Iraqis, again, have been quite cooperative on this effort, and the Central Bank of Iraq has published a list of in excess of 100 exchange houses that are in ISIL-controlled territory. This is a dynamic list. Entities could get added to this list from time to time if we have concerns about a particular entity, and they also come off the list as territory is liberated. But there's an excess of 100 exchange houses that are on this list. It's a public list on the Iraqi website. I talk about it with central bank governors and other regulators around the world all the time. It's important for financial institutions around the world to understand that they should be consulting that list and making sure that that they are not doing business with any of these quote-unquote blacklisted exchange houses. In addition, we have a very, very active information exchange, information sharing, number of information sharing arrangements with the Iraqis so they could be alerted to any information or concerns that we have about particular exchange houses. And then it is, of course, also quite important and something that we work on very closely with the Iraqis to ensure that this is not just a central bank effort. The central bank is obviously important as a regulator of these institutions, but this is something that needs to be, that their law enforcement authorities need to be involved in, that their security services need to be involved in, that their finance ministry needs to be involved in, that their justice ministry needs to be involved in. We've formed a group called the U.S.-Iraq Committee to Counter Terrorist Financing, that all of these groups are in fact involved in. We at the Treasury Department are involved, are part of that group as well. It meets periodically, and it's one of the ways that we try to encourage Iraq to take sort of the all-of-government approach to these problems that really it needs to bring to bear in order to be as effective as we could be. So that's where it starts. That's Iraq. And again, we have seen results from this. Millions of dollars have been blocked by the Iraqis from these blacklisted exchange houses. Millions of dollars have been blocked. That's an important signal that they're taking this quite seriously. We've also seen the Iraqis take steps to improve the regulation of their financial system. They've adopted anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing laws, and they're issuing regulations to make those as to implement them. But it's not just, as we all know, it's not just enacting laws and regulations. It is really, at the end of the day, comes down to implementation. And we've seen them take extraordinary steps to make sure that not only are the banks in Baghdad appropriately regulated, but they've sent teams out to places like Kirkuk to ensure that they have an eye on what's going on in areas that are closer to ISIL control. They've worked very closely and are working very closely with the authorities in the Kurdish region to ensure that there's a uniform anti-money laundering system throughout the country. So again, a lot of work to be done. I don't want to paint too rosy a picture. There's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of capacity to be developed. And this is a really, really tough problem set. As we get information in the United States that gives us greater insight into Iraqi financial networks, we share that information as much as we can. But that information is hard to come by, and it's something that we're still developing, and it's still a challenge for us. So I don't want to give you the impression that this is an issue that's been solved, but what I do want to give you the impression of, it's an issue that's been well identified, and that there's a lot of effort going into addressing. And that, again, is just talking about Iraq. Now, even though it starts with Iraq, it certainly doesn't end with Iraq, and there's responsibilities both regionally and globally. And we work very closely with the governments throughout the region, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Jordan, whether it's UAE, whether it's Lebanon, to make sure that they're doing what they need to do to make sure that ISIL doesn't gain access to those financial systems. I will say this issue is going to become, as we succeed in the military campaign, as ISIL loses territory, this is only going to become more important because what you see ISIL developing towards is, again, a more traditional terrorist organization that, again, will increasingly rely on their access to the international financial system, both to raise money and to spend money. And as that happens, as that becomes more important, as they develop towards focusing more on their affiliates, as they develop more on being a dispersed global organization that needs to maintain networks, the work that we do regionally and the work that we do globally is only going to become more important. And so we work very closely, again, with the Emiratis, with the Jordanians and with other countries in the region to make sure that that's being addressed appropriately. And then, as I said, globally, as we focus on external plotting, as we focus on ISIL as a global organization, as we focus on ISIL evolving towards, again, a more traditional terrorist organization, the global effort that we've been really engaged in since 9/11 becomes more and more important, and organizations like the Financial Action Task Force, which sets international standards for anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing, become more important. The UN efforts become more important. The efforts even within the coalition. The counter-ISIL, the coalition is not just a military coalition, it's a counter-ISIL coalition with a variety of lines of effort. One of those lines of effort is obviously the military line of effort. One of those lines of effort is the counter-finance line of effort, and I co-chair that line of effort along with Saudi Arabia and Italy. We're in fact meeting in a couple of weeks in Kuwait, and that will bring over 30 countries together to talk about the things that people are doing throughout the world, whether in Asia, whether in Europe, in the Middle East, North America, South America, to make sure that the global ISIL financial threat is as contained as possible. And that's an important group, and it's an important line of effort, and it's one that we take quite seriously. So again, Iraq, then regional, and then global, and that's the plan. That's the secret plan that you guys are all clued in on now. Again, I was going to conclude by talking about the challenges that we see in front of us. I think I've already kind of touched on them, though, already. The first in the area of challenges that we see in front of us is all the old challenges. So I'm glad I could paint a rosy picture about the impact we're having on oil, and I'm glad I could paint a rosy picture about the impact that we're having on liquidity. I think it's important that we acknowledge the progress that we've made, but I think it's also important to emphasize they're still making money on oil, they're still making money on gas, they're still making money on taxation, and they're making a lot of money. And so this isn't about resting on our laurels. We understand that this is an ongoing effort, and frankly, they're going to be making that money until they get pushed off the territory that they control, which hopefully will happen as quickly as possible. But until that does happen, we're going to be focusing our efforts on the types of things that I talked about before. But in the terms of new challenges, again, it's what I was talking about before. As they evolve towards more traditional terrorist organization, as they lose control of territory, it's only going to put more pressure on us to up our game with respect to depriving them from access to the financial system. And that's going to mean working in organizations like the FATF and the UN, and the coalition Counter-ISIL Finance Group. But it's also going to involve a lot of work that the U.S. does bilaterally with our partners around the world. Again, that is very similar to the work that we do with respect to Al-Qaeda or other terrorist organizations, in terms of sharing information, in terms of identifying donors, in terms of identifying charitable organizations that may be on the wrong side of this issue. Those are standard things that we've done since 9/11 that Matt, when he was at Treasury, was doing as well, and it's something that we're going to continue to do, and as I said, is going to become more and more important in the future. So with that, I'm going to conclude my remarks. Again, I'm happy to answer questions on this issue. I'm happy to answer questions on broader terrorist financing issues, but thanks for your attention.
Excellent, Danny. Thank you very much. The podium is going to magically be pulled back by somebody so that people sitting on the side of the room can see. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to take a breather and have a glass of water and stall for a second. Thank you. And I'll take the moderator's prerogative to ask the first question, and then we'll open up to everybody, and I'll get you as I see you. Dana, let's posit continued success, just for the fun of it. I'd like you to answer what that might look like, what the consequences might be domestically within the areas that the Islamic State still controls in terms of its financing, and what the nature of its financial relationship might be with its far-flung provinces. So domestically, if we think about this as a balloon, we squeeze the balloon not so hard that it pops, but we make it harder for them to raise money through, say, oil and gas or other things. And the logic has it that perhaps they would then move to other areas that might be available to them, including some that they haven't used traditionally, like the donors and the abuse of charity that you mentioned at the very end there. Do you see those or other areas as places we need to keep an eye on, areas for fundraising that they may try and tap into now that some of the more traditional fundraising tools and they've had at their that they've been able to tap into are denied them? And then in terms of their relationships abroad, the UN monitoring report talks about payments, including through banks, including through exchange houses, that the Islamic State, despite all of our best efforts, have still been able to make to some of the far-flung provinces. And a lot of us are beginning to think about what happens in the post, quote-unquote, caliphate period, as you mentioned in the opening of your remarks, as the Islamic State becomes less of a state-like and more insurgent and international terrorist organization. Might we see them trying to send money to some of these provinces as a place where they could kind of set up shop in an ISIL 2.0 scenario?
Sure. So with respect to the first part of your question on sort of the way you describe it, squeezing the balloon and domestically, and what are the implications of that? We've already seen that. So we see as they are losing access to oil wealth and other forms of wealth, they're increasing taxation. They're trying to extract more resources from the limited pool that they have. There's limits to that. There's an upper limit to what they're going to be able to do on that. What we're trying to do is push down on that upper limit again, why I focus a lot on liquidity. At the end of the day, they could only extract resources to the extent that there's liquidity for them to extract. And so I think it's a combination of continuing to squeeze the balloon, but making sure that the whole sort of potential level of resources available to them is as low as possible. And then again, as the territory that they control continues to decrease, that's also going to be a separate check on their ability to expand that. So then the question becomes, is, as you said, do they turn to foreign resources? Well, first of all, there's no level of external financing that's going to equal the $1 billion or more that they could make a year, off of controlling a territory like this. So there's really no substitute for that. Now that said, as I said, as they lose territory, as they, to use your term, move to sort of a post-caliphate entity, whatever that entity may look like, it does become incumbent upon us to look even harder. We're looking at it pretty hard now, but to focus our efforts even more on the ability of them to generate wealth through more traditional, methods that we see Al-Qaeda using, whether it's deep pocket donors, whether it's charities, whether it's NGOs, whether it's other criminal activity, and I do think, as I said before, I think that's as they lose the ability to gain wealth from the territory they control, we need to make sure that these other sources are deprived from them, and we'll do that. But those sources will never equal what they can make domestically now. With respect to your question about affiliates, I think it's a really interesting question. The affiliates themselves do not have the ability to generate resources the way ISIL within Syria and Iraq do. The only one that people are even a little bit concerned about would be Libya, because they see a lot of similarities between, ISIL controlling territory within Libya, taking a city within Libya, there being an oil sector within Libya. But we're talking a fraction of the wealth. They don't make any money off of the oil sector within Libya, and to the extent that they are focused on the oil sector, it is to destroy its capacity, not to take advantage of its capacity. With respect to their ability to extract wealth from territory within Libya, as I said, when they went into Mosul, there was in excess of $500 million, $10 million dinars available to them. When they went into Sirte, there was approximately $4 million available to them. Now, $4 million is not, I don't want ISIL to have $4 million, but that's a qualitatively different problem than $500 million. So even in a scenario like Libya, they do not have the ability to generate wealth. Again, that brings us back to what we were just talking about. So it's about identifying networks. This is what we do. This is what you did, Matt. It's about identifying networks, and it's about then taking action to dismantle those networks, to undermine those networks. And that's something that we are working quite hard on. We're working quite hard within the U.S. government on it, and we're working quite hard with various countries in that region on it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And really, that whole question was really a plug for a Washington Institute study on the Islamic State provinces that's about to come out with some focus on the financial side, and so there was that plug. So I'd like to open it up to questions and answers from the audience now, and we have plenty of time to get to everybody. We're going to take the prerogative of starting with a former Washington Institute research assistant, AJ Beloff.
Hi, thank you very much. AJ Beloff, now at Bank of America. So as you see ISIS kind of resorting to a more traditional financing model, do you believe U.S. financial institutions are doing enough to combat this sort of fundraising?
Again, I do want to emphasize that ISIL currently makes the vast majority of their wealth, continues to make the vast majority of their wealth from internal sources. I think it's fair to assume that, again, as those internal sources are deprived of access to those, they will turn to more traditional terrorist financing models. With respect to U.S. banks, I think banks around the world, this gets to international anti-money laundering counter-terrorist financing standards as articulated by the Financial Action Task Force. And I do think I think the U.S. regime is as strong or not stronger than any regime in the world in that regard. And I think our banks take it quite seriously. And I think that we've demonstrated that when we don't feel that the banks are doing the right thing, we're perfectly prepared to find them and to ensure that those deficiencies are addressed. So yes, I'm comfortable that our banks are doing what they need to do. One thing I'll note, because maybe people might think I'm biased on this question, is next week, Financial Action Task Force is having one of its big plenary sessions in Paris, and the number one item on the agenda is the mutual evaluation of the United States. And that will be publicly released at the end of next week, and that will be an objective assessment of where the U.S. is on AML/CFT issues, warts and all. So, if you really want to know what an objective people think, then you should look at the FATF. But I think we're going to do very well on that review.
Are there any warts you're anticipating out of that?
Yeah, well, the issues that we ourselves have identified, we have deficiencies in customer due diligence. We have deficiencies, particularly with respect to beneficial ownership. These are deficiencies that we've long acknowledged and are working hard to address. But I anticipate FATF will remind us of those deficiencies.
Excellent. Right here, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Glaser. Yahya Fanusi, Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Really enjoyed your remarks and appreciate your state of play on the banking, the formal and informal financial sector in Iraq. Two things. One, could you share a little bit about or give us your assessment on the state of play for the particularly the informal financial sector in Syria and affiliate places like Libya, and also your assessment of, you already mentioned that these affiliates can't raise money, but what about their ability to receive money from the home base through these informal through the informal sector?
Yeah, sure. So, with respect to your question about Syria, we obviously have less insight into Syria than we do in Iraq, because we have in Iraq a willing and enthusiastic partner that we certainly don't have in Syria. In fact, in Syria, it's quite the opposite. We have the Assad regime, which through gas deals is actually providing financing to ISIL. So that's a fundamentally different set of challenges that we have with respect to Syria. Fortunately, the Syrian financial system has been effectively cut off from the international financial system for some time, based on international sanctions on Syria that have been long-standing. So, access to the Syrian formal financial sector. I'm not saying that we could theoretically rule it out, but I don't think it's very attractive. If I were a financial emir within ISIL, I don't know that would be the most attractive way of gaining access to the financial sector. Of course, informal, hawala and other forms of informal money remittance in Syria and elsewhere is a concern. This is one of the important things, since we don't have a partner in Syria, this is one of the important things that we talk to the countries in the region about, whether it's Jordan, whether it's Lebanon, countries with that traditionally have large trade with Syria. There are pre-existing informal networks that it's important that we identify, and it's important that we crack down on, and that's something that we work actively with the countries in the region on. With respect to your second question, in terms of the ability of ISIL to fund its affiliates from sort of its central base, if you will, in Iraq and Syria, we have seen some of that. I think, and again, this is classic counterterrorist financing. It's identifying the networks, and it's about dismantling the networks. Without getting into too many details on it, it's something that we're aware of, and it's something that we're working very hard on. But it's a tough nut to crack. It is very, very hard to identify financial networks. It's hard to understand them, but we're doing our best on that. I will say that these affiliates have the ability to self-finance to a certain degree, not, as I said, on the ISIL model that I was talking about with respect to Libya, but with respect to local extortion rackets, criminal activity, things that the terrorist organizations and just criminal organizations do to sustain themselves.
Excellent. Barbara up here. We'll get over there.
Thanks, Matt. I'm Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. Nice to see you, Danny. A couple questions. Do you have an estimate for how much ISIL makes by selling, is it just gas or also oil to the Assad regime? And how that number has been affected by U.S. action. Can you talk a little bit about how Nusra is funded? Where do they, because that's a more traditional terrorist organization, where do they get their money from? And finally, I can't resist, can you comment on how much progress Iran is making on satisfying FATF? They had an action plan, the countermeasures have been suspended. I just interviewed their economy minister who says, they're doing a great job on this now, and I'd love your assessment on that. Thanks.
Well, he says so.
I'm sorry, what was the first part? I'm sorry, Barbara.
The first question was how much money
Syria.
they get from selling oil and gas to Assad.
So it's just gas. It's not oil at all. It's gas. That's what they do. And it's a very complex relationship, and it involves barter and exchange of services. And there's probably some money involved there also. But no, I don't have an estimate on sort of the dollar figure. I don't have an estimate to give you on that. The second question was Nusra. Thank you for asking that question, because I normally mention it in my prepared remarks, and I didn't this time. So I'm glad you raised the question, because I don't want to give people the impression that this campaign is just about ISIL. It's not just about ISIL. We talk about ISIL, and people say al-Nusra, and it sounds like this very exotic sort of thing. I mean, al-Nusra is al-Qaeda in Syria. That's what we should call them. We should call them al-Qaeda in Syria, because that's what they are. And we have to treat them as such. And they are dangerous, and they are threatening, and they are something that we do focus on. They do have, so they have the ability to extract a certain amount of wealth from territory that they control, but it's not the same sort of thing. And as a result, as I think your question implied, this gets to classical terrorist financing. This gets to working with our friends and partners in the Gulf to make sure that Gulf-based donors and organizations are cut off from al-Nusra. It's about working with banks and other institutions to make sure that al-Nusra and al-Nusra-related fronts don't have access. It's our standard set of issues, but it's very, very important. I'm a frequent visitor to the Gulf. I'll be going to the Gulf, as I said, in a couple of weeks. And one of the issues that we talk to our friends in the Gulf about quite a bit is al-Nusra. So, yes.
A particular country that's, Qatar, Kuwait, any of these countries that are...
I don't think there's a particular country. I think that, I'd be happy to talk about individual countries if somebody would like me to. I think that I think that there's been a lot of progress in the Gulf. I think there's been a lot of progress in countries like Qatar and Kuwait. But I also think that there are individuals operating in that region that need to be addressed pretty urgently. So I think it's a mixed bag. But I do want to emphasize, particularly with respect to Qatar and Kuwait, that they have made, that we've seen a lot of positive steps from them recently, to include criminal prosecutions of terrorist financiers in Qatar, which is not nothing, which is actually a real sign of political will. Third question was on Iran and FATF. So there's really no update on it. In June, Iran agreed to and made a high-level political commitment to implement an action plan to address the concerns that FATF had identified, and as a result of that, FATF temporarily suspended countermeasures. At the same time, and in the same statement, FATF asserted that it remained concerned about the terrorist financing risk emanating from Iran, and said that it continued to call upon countries around the world to exercise enhanced due diligence with respect to transactions involving Iran, and said that call for enhanced due diligence would remain, and the concern with respect to terrorist financing risk emanating from Iran will remain until Iran has addressed all the issues within its action plan. FATF has not met since then, so there's no developments to report. If you spoke to the Iranian government about that and they told you that they're making progress on their action plan, I suppose that's good news. But that's not until that's recognized by FATF. That's not going to be considered progress.
Just to follow up on one quick thing, Danny. There's a great question just now about Nusra Front. Technically, Nusra Front doesn't exist anymore. It's now Jabhat Fatah al-Sham. And I wonder if there's any plan by the U.S. government to designate an AKA for this organization, and if you think that's necessary or important.
Well, as you know, I can't talk about plans on future designations, but I could assure you that whatever Al-Nusra Fund is calling itself is not going to limit our enthusiasm in pursuing it.
Okay. Yes, ma'am, right over here.
Hi, thank you. I'm Jenna Lifitz with the Weekly Standard.
Hi.
I also had an Iran-related question. I read the new OFAC FAQ that came out recently, and I was a little bit confused. The new wording seems to allow businesses to work with companies that are wholly owned by the IRGC or IRGC-controlled entities. Is that true? Is that an accurate reading?
So I'm sorry, I'm not talking about the nuclear deal. What I am here to talk about is terrorist financing, and if you would like me to talk about Iran with respect to FATF, happy to. Also happy to talk about our concerns with respect to Iran's involvement in terrorist financing. But I'm not going to talk about the nuclear deal or FAQs issued.
The OFAC FAQ.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
What concerns do you have then about Iran and terror financing?
My concerns about Iran with respect to terrorist financing is that they are a state sponsor of terrorism, and that they are the chief financier of Hezbollah, and almost single-handedly keep Hezbollah afloat. And this is a grave issue. It's an issue we take very seriously. It's an issue that nobody's more of an expert on Hezbollah financing than Matt Levitt, but I'm
done.
But it's something that, as you know, Matt, I work very hard on, and we work very hard with the Lebanese on it, and we work very hard around the world on it, in particular on implementing the new legislation enacted by Congress that's designed to exclude Hezbollah from the financial system around the world. But this is something that is a priority for us at the Treasury Department, and it's something that we are going to continue to pursue quite aggressively. And frankly, it's something that I think we're having some success on. I think that Hezbollah is having a tremendously difficult time gaining access to the Lebanese financial system, and I think that's attributable to the hard work of the people who participate in the Lebanese financial system and the cooperation and partnership we have with them. Because they understand how important it is for their own access to the international financial system to make sure that Hezbollah does not gain access through those institutions. And we've seen all various manifestations of Hezbollah's concerns about that.
Well, that answer has led to some hand waving in the back from a Lebanese analyst. Can we go to Haneen in the back?
Thank you very much. You just said that you're having, you can see some success when it comes to Hezbollah financing in Lebanon working. You're talking probably about the Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act, right?
Right.
And it's true that it's causing a lot of nuisance for Hezbollah, especially where it close the banks of institutions, charity institutions, social and media institutions. But the money is still coming, and they're not going to go broke because of that. And on the problem they're having is not really about the banks closing their accounts, in as much as the spending policy shifted within the institutions. So are you going to do more about that? Are you going to have more extreme measures to stop the financing coming from Iran, or this is it, the Prevention Act is all you're going to do? Thank you.
So couple reactions. First of all, to the extent that I implied that terrorist financing is a silver bullet with respect to Hezbollah, it's not. Our terrorist financing efforts aren't going to uproot Hezbollah from South Lebanon. We understand that. But what we can do, and what we've demonstrated that we are doing, and what we are going to continue to do, is challenge Hezbollah's access to the Lebanese financial system. And that's something, frankly, that people never thought we would be able to do. That we could, but what we've shown in the area of illicit finance, whether it's with respect to Hezbollah, whether it's with respect to North Korea, whether it's with respect to Iran, whether it's with respect to any of our targets, is what we've consistently shown is that we can reach out and make our adversaries feel uncomfortable in areas in which they always thought they were safe. And that's what we're doing with respect to our efforts with respect to Hezbollah financing. I wouldn't characterize any of the efforts that we've done as extreme. I will say that Our efforts against Hezbollah financing and Hezbollah financial access within Lebanon predate HIFPA. HIFPA is a relatively new act. Our work with the Lebanese financial system and Lebanese financial institutions and Lebanese financial authorities predate HIFPA. HIFPA is another arrow in our quiver. It's not the only arrow in our quiver, and it's not the only one that we use. And it's not the only one that we will continue to use moving forward. But we've shown with the actions we took in 2011 with respect to Lebanese Canadian Bank under Section 311 of the Patriot Act. We've shown with respect to our classic, Executive Order 13224 terrorist financing sanctions against a variety of Lebanese exchange houses. We've shown with various law enforcement actions that have been taken that we have a wide range of authorities that we are going to continue to bring to bear to deprive Hezbollah of access to the financial system. And I should say this is not just about Lebanon. The word Lebanon doesn't even appear in HIFPA. This is about Hezbollah's access to the international financial system, and we will pursue that throughout the world. And I think it's important that I emphasize that. This is not about Lebanon, and it is not about the Lebanese financial system. Now, obviously, Hezbollah is quite present in Lebanon, so it impacts the Lebanese financial system disproportionately. But it's not about Lebanon, it's not about the Lebanese financial system, it's about Hezbollah's access to the financial system broadly, and we will pursue that throughout the world.
Patrick Clausen, and then we'll come over here.
If I understood you properly, you were saying that part of U.S. government counterterrorism strategy is to block the access of terrorist organizations to the international financial system. And one of the organizations which the U.S. government, I believe, is designated as a terrorist organization is the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. I'd be interested in your comments about U.S. government efforts to block IRGC access to the international financial system, and in particular access by companies that are partly owned or controlled by the IRGC. What would you say is U.S. government efforts to block access of such companies to the international financial system?
Sure. Well, so to be clear, as far as designated terrorist organization, the Quds Force is a designated terrorist organization, and they're treated as a designated terrorist organization, and all of our terrorist financing laws and rules apply, and I think we have a fairly good track record of demonstrating zero tolerance for Quds Force access to the financial system in any way, shape, or form. Obviously, we are also tremendously focused on the ability of the IRGC to access the financial system. There's a variety of sanctions that remain in effect with respect to the IRGC, and frankly, the fact that the IRGC operates through front companies and through other forms of non-transparent ownership has created problems for the Iranians. So it's something that we understand, and it's something that we continue to be focused on.
Bilal right here, and then the gentleman right next to him.
Thank you very much for coming. My name is Bilal Wahab. I'm at the Washington Institute. I have two quick questions bringing the conversation back to Iraq. If I understand correctly, it seems that you identified one of the structural issues of terror financing in Iraq being the cash economy that Iraq has. And you also mentioned that you have good contacts inside the Iraqi government and good relations with the central bank. Is there any effort to help the Iraqi government have a better financial system and away from a cash economy as we start having the conversation about stability in a post-ISIS Iraq and as the liberation of Mosul nears? And then since, on a related note to stability in a post-ISIS Iraq, any efforts on curbing the financing of the militias that are slated to be next in line for more instability in Iraq? Thank you.
So with respect to your first question about broader Iraqi financial system, I think you put your finger right on it. It's a primarily cash economy, and that causes a wide range of problems related to terrorist financing and not related to terrorist financing. And modernizing that economy it needs to be job number one for the financial authorities in Iraq. As I said, I think they understand that. We at the Treasury Department are providing assistance to Iraq in this area in a number of ways, which I could rattle off, but it's probably not the best use of our time. They work with the IMF, they work with the World Bank, they work with a variety of countries around the world. This is a problem, I think, that's understood. It's easier to understand the problem than it is to solve the problem, because we're talking about, building a modern financial system. I don't want to say from scratch, but we're talking about building a modern financial system that doesn't exist right now. And that's going to be a long-term effort, as I said, even with respect to the exchange houses, which is just the beginning of the issue, right? That's an aspect of the issue. It's going to take years to get that sector where it needs to be. And work's starting right now. So I guess the short answer to your question is yes, we're providing assistance. The international financial institutions are providing assistance. Other countries are providing assistance. The Iraqis have recognized this as something they need to do, and it's something that will happen over the course of years. With respect to militia financing, certainly any entity that's designated as a terrorist organization, we will pursue with vigor. Our priority right now is on ISIL and on al-Nusra, and on making sure that those entities which have demonstrated a will and an ability to threaten Americans throughout the world is where we're focusing our effort right now.
Gentleman right here.
Ken Meyercourt, WorldDocs. A year or so ago, it was announced that the Treasury Department was going to look into where the Islamic State obtained the funds to purchase all those Toyota pickups that it used in trying to take over Iraq. This was before the three sources of financing you mentioned were available to them. In fact, I think it was before it was called the Islamic State. Whatever came of that investigation?
So it wasn't before it became the Islamic State. It wasn't before those sources of financing were related to them. Those trucks and those videos of those trucks go back to like last summer, so the summer of 2015, if I remember correctly, is when there was a lot of focus on those trucks. To be honest with you, I'm less concerned about those trucks right now than I am about their ability to generate vast amounts of wealth. There's a number of theories which have been put forward as to how they got those trucks. There have been a number of investigations which are continuing, but I don't have any update for you on those truck videos. But that was from about a year and a half ago, not even.
Let's come over here to David, all the way at the edge here.
Good afternoon, Special Agent David Kane with Homeland Security Investigations. Three-part, it's basically intertwined questions. You spoke about hawalas, and you spoke about the exchange houses. Are you finding that the exchange houses are basically doubling as hawaladars, or are they separate? Second part of the question, for the hawalas, are they as effective in their structure with remittances within the territories of Syria and Iraq as they are externally? And lastly, what is the typical transaction capacity for these entities? How much cash do they have on hand? What are we seeing?
So with respect to your first question, so technically exchange houses are not supposed to be conducting remittances, but it is obvious that through many of these exchange houses there's an ability to transfer wealth. And that gets to some pretty fundamental regulatory and supervisory issues, which is going to be very difficult for the Iraqis to tackle as long as there's 1,900 exchange houses, which is why, as I said, that's the long term. Short term, we're trying to identify which exchange houses have the ability to provide these services to ISIL or are in fact providing them, and making sure that those are publicly identified. And then there's other ones that we don't publicly identify, but we're working on those too. So that's I think that's an answer to your first question. Your second question, I'm sorry. So your second question was, are hawaladars? I didn't understand.
Do they have a very extensive network within Syria and Iraq to be able to remit from city to city, or is that structure not really there? Is it coming external with limited hawaladar recipients within Syria and Iraq?
Again, it's harder for me to talk about Syria. We have less insight into Syria. I presume extensive Hawala network within Syria, but I don't have really anything to base that on other than just sort of common sense. With respect to Iraq, again, of course, look, it's a common way of transferring wealth within that region, and there's nothing theoretically wrong with it. There's historical trade, relationships that existed prior to the war that were presumably financed through Hawala. So these exist, and there's something that we look for, and there's something you guys look for. If you want to know what I'm most concerned about, it's exchange houses. That's what I'm most concerned about. But certainly, I never want to give anybody the impression that there's anything that we're not concerned about. We're concerned about bulk movement of cash. We're concerned about Hawala. We're concerned about exchange houses, and even banks. Although I do think that of all those, banks are the least likely to be abused at this point. And then your third question, I apologize, I'm having a hard time.
What is the transaction capacity for these Hawalas and exchange houses? Is it, can they handle a transaction of 1.5 million, 10 million? I know it varies, but
it varies, but some of them are quite large. Some of them are quite large. I mean, they can handle millions of dollars.
Right up front, please.
Thank you. I'm Al Mudallali with the Wilson Center.
Hey.
Hi, Dan. How are you?
Good.
I have an easy question for you.
Thank you.
What is the difference or the similarities and the differences between ISIL's terror financing and Hezbollah's? What are the challenges to stop Hezbollah's financing and ISIL's? Thank you.
It is an easy question. The primary difference is that Hezbollah makes the vast majority of its wealth through a state sponsor, that being Iran. And that's not how ISIL generates its wealth, or ISIL does not have state sponsors. So, I mean, that's the answer to your question. Hezbollah gets hundreds of millions of dollars a year from Iran. And that's the fundamental challenge that we were talking about before, is it's very difficult for us to interfere, to disrupt that, the provision of cash to Hezbollah by Iran. It's difficult for us to disrupt that. But what we can do is disrupt Hezbollah's access to the financial system as much as possible, and that's what we try to do. There's all sorts of ways, but it's a lot of cash.
Mike Kraft. 1 second, just wait for a mic, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike Kraft, a counterterrorism writer. Since nobody else brought up Saudi Arabia, which somewhat to my surprise, I'll bring it up in a couple of contexts. One, you kind of alluded to the Gulf countries in terms of cooperating on the efforts, but there's also been long-time concern about Saudi Arabia financing the madrasas, and this fits in, or the part of the concern about countering terrorism violence program. So it's not just centered on Syria and Iraq, but also Pakistan and perhaps North Africa. What kind of cooperation are you getting? And I know the standard line is the government is not involved, but there's wealthy individuals. Are you making any success in getting the Saudis to crack down on them? I mean, are they enforcing their regulations vigorously?
It's more than the standard line. It happens to be the truth. Look, I think that we at the Treasury Department are probably fairly credible voice with respect to Saudi Arabia. When Matt was around, we were very publicly critical of Saudi Arabia and their efforts with respect to terrorist financing. This is going back over 10 years, 10 years ago. I think we've seen over the past 10 years a huge shift in Saudi's approach to terrorist financing, and I really do regard them as our number one partner in the Gulf in our efforts against terrorist financing. You've seen in recent months and over the past year, we've done joint designations with the Saudis. They are a very enthusiastic partner of ours in our efforts against terrorist financing. In fact, when I think about terrorist financing in the Gulf, my goal is to see that same sort of evolution in the other Gulf countries that we've seen in Saudi Arabia. This is not to say that there's not terrorist financing that's going on in Saudi Arabia. There is absolutely terrorist financing that goes on in Saudi Arabia. And it's with respect to donors, and it's with respect to people who come and abuse Saudi hospitality during the Hajj. And it presents a lot of difficulties for them and for us. But what I can say is we have a very willing and capable partner in the Saudis in our efforts against terrorist financing. Again, the goal, my goal, our goal, is to see a similar evolution in countries like Qatar and Kuwait, and I think we are starting to see that evolution. But what I'd like to see is that evolution come to sort of fully evolve. There was a second part of your question, or was there? Is there a part that I missed?
Well, in terms of the madrasas.
Oh, yes. So, look, I mean, that's an important, I mean, that gets into the whole, as you yourself said, gets sort of more broadly into countering violent extremism, and the challenges that Saudi Arabia faces in terms of ensuring that as they pursue what they believe to be their religious obligations, that doesn't what doesn't come with it is the promotion of extremist views, and that remains a challenge for them, and that's something that they are going to be continuing to struggle with, I'm sure, for quite some time. And I'll leave it at that.
Tina, if I could follow up, recent government official statements have included statements along the lines of that some of the financing within Saudi Arabia, because of the actions the Saudis have taken to combat terror financing, tend to involve things like donors in Saudi Arabia sending money to collectors or bundlers in places like Qatar and Kuwait, who then send them onward. First of all, can you talk about that, about the nature of fundraising, not within any one country, but across the Gulf? And second, am I correct in assuming that that is more likely to be financing the Nusra's, Al-Qaeda in Syria, al-Sham type of groups, and less likely to be financing Islamic State, who, if I recall correctly, the last public estimate was that no more than 5% of the Islamic State's budget was assumed to have come from charity?
So I'm not sure, you sort of answered you just presented a statement in that first question.
I
agree with the statement. I agree with the statement. I agree with your first question. With respect to the percentage, yes, the center of gravity of terrorist financing in the Gulf is related to Al-Qaeda, whether that's Al-Qaeda in Syria, i.e. al-Nusra, or whether that's Al-Qaeda in Yemen, or whether that's Al-Qaeda in Yemen would be in the Arabian Peninsula, as they call themselves, or whether that's Al-Qaeda or other Al-Qaeda affiliated groups in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. That is where the center of gravity of terrorist financing is. And that's what's very important to focus the attention of our friends in the Gulf on, is taking steps against ISIL financing is important, and they need to be doing it, and they are doing it. But ISIL doesn't rely on that income stream. What is important is to continue to remind our friends in the Gulf that it's equally important that they be focusing on the Al-Qaeda portion of this, because that's really what the terrorist financing issue in the Gulf is all about right now. Now, again, over time, as your first question implied, over time, as ISIL begins to rely more and more on external donors, will that become more of an issue? We'll see. But it is important in the Gulf for them to focus on al-Nusra and on Al-Qaeda with the same enthusiasm and energy that they focus on ISIL.
A moment ago, you were talking about the financing of Hezbollah through state sponsors like Iran. Barbara asked earlier about compliance with FATF, which leads me to ask you about Iran's ability to fully comply with FATF, given its very vocal insistence that it will maintain a cutout for what it calls resistance organizations, but what you here have called terrorist organizations. Do you think that that's going to be a stumbling block moving forward, especially as we go forward to the next FATF meeting in a few weeks?
Don't expect there to be any news to come out of the next FATF meeting on Iran. This is a long-term action plan And for those of you who are waiting with bated breath for there to be some big news coming out of this fat of plenary in Iran, you're going to be disappointed. I don't expect there to be much of a conversation at all. I mean, it will be more of a checking in status check, but I don't expect, this is a long-term project for Iran. I don't want to sort of speak for FATF, and I don't want to anticipate what the Iranians may or may not do with respect to the implementation of their action plan. What I will say is it's quite clear that exceptions to terrorist financing laws that make exceptions for national liberation movements or other types of movements have not been acceptable to FATF in the past, and I don't expect them to be acceptable to FATF in the future. And that is, and FATF has a record on this. There are other countries that have had similar sorts of carve-outs, and FATF has been quite consistent in saying that those are not acceptable.
Yes, right here.
Hi, Alex Zenz, Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more as to the role that ransom payments, particularly from European countries, are playing in terrorist financing and how we're working to interdict those. Thanks.
Well, so in 2015, I think the number we used for ransom payments was $47 million. Is that right? Yeah. So $47 million, I think, is the number that we've used for ISIL ransom payments. Maybe we say 20 to 40 million. I don't know, something in that area. So that's like a lot of money on the one hand. On the other hand, it's not a lot of money compared to what they receive from other sources. But it's something that we focus on. It's something that we focus on within the CIFIG, the Counter-ISIL Finance Group. They're issued a communique maybe a year ago, reaffirming the principle of that countries should not be paying ransoms. The United States' position on this is quite clear and has been quite consistent. When you say disrupt it, it's really not a question so much of disrupting a ransom payment. I mean, if it were coming from the United States and we knew about it, we would want to disrupt it. But it's again about depriving them of access to the financial system so they can't use the money. There's just these groups, whether it's ISIL or anybody else, they're going to make a certain amount of money through criminal activities, whether it's kidnapping, whether it's bank robbery, whether it's smuggling, whether it's whatever. There's a whole wide variety of criminal activities that they participate in, and that on a certain level that becomes a local law enforcement issue, and how we respond to it is by trying to deprive them of access to the financial system so they can't profit from it. But we've had a very consistent position on kidnapping for ransom.
If I can follow up with another kind of deep dive question, one of the areas of purported Islamic State finance of particular debate is their ability to raise money through antiquities, looting antiquities. Has that traditionally been a significant source of revenue for them, and is it still?
So I don't think it's ever been a huge source of income for them, and you knew I was going to answer that way.
But maybe they didn't.
But you did it with such a straight face.
Thank you. I got 4 kids. I got to play that game.
Look, as I said, ISIL profits from any economic activity that occurs within the territory that it controls, primarily through taxation and fees. So to the extent that there is antiquity smuggling that occurs, and I'm sure that there is, ISIL profits from that by taxing it or by charging fees to people for engaging in it. That's how they profit from antiquity smuggling, in the same way that they would profit from any type of smuggling that goes on in their territory. And to that extent, the way we counter that, again, is by reducing liquidity in the area and by reducing their access to the financial system. I have seen no evidence of sort of global ISIL-controlled antiquities smuggling networks the way it seems to have captured some people's imagination. I've seen very little evidence of that. It's another area of smuggling through their territory that they charge fees to profit from. That's my understanding
of how they profit from antiquities trade.
Please join me in thanking Danny Glaser for coming today.
Thank you.
As you can see, there's a huge range of illicit finance that the Treasury Department is responsible for countering. This is only one slice of it, a very important slice. We appreciate the work you do day in, day out. And as a taxpayer, I'm very pleased that you're only able to be here with us for this couple of hours.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great day.
Thanks.